Hey guys, welcome back to Edpuzzle. With 2 days off from school, I didn't want to leave too much time in between, but I want to jump ahead and talk about the Spanish-American War. We have finished up conquering Hawaii and Alaska, those two superpowers that we were able to take down as we started to establish our empire. But the Spanish-American War will really forever change the course of American foreign policy. And you can see this quote here. I've seen two Americas, as a foreign diplomat observed, the America before the Spanish-American War and the America since. And this was actually an LEQ a few years ago, really explaining, asking you to explain how the Spanish-American War forever changed American foreign policy. And we'll get into the effects of that throughout the rest of this chapter and into World War I. But as with any war, there are always some direct causes, some indirect causes. And in the United States, both play a very important role. The first one, of course, is America's itching to have an empire, right? We've taken Hawaii, we've taken Alaska, but that's not really enough. And Spain is really going to be an easy victim for us as the war progresses. The second one is the Cuban Revolution. Cuba was really one of the last pieces of the Spanish Empire in the Western Hemisphere, because at this point they'd really lost most of their South American colonies. And Cuba, which was suffering from incredible poverty because of how weak the Spanish Empire was, starts a revolution in order to overthrow Spanish rule. And the American public, thanks to a couple of guys we'll meet in a minute, are really forced to side with the Cubans and the atrocities that are happening from a guy named General Weyler. He was known as the Butcher for his creation of reconcentrados, which are the equivalent of concentration camps, basically work concentration camps. As news of this really genocide comes to America, people start realizing we need to intervene in Cuba. This comes as a result of this, public knowledge comes from what we call yellow journalism. If you have any Spider-Man fans in the house, you recognize the guy over here as J. Jonah Jameson, who is really, the best example of yellow journalism. From our vocab, we know, right? It's really using what we know today as clickbait to sell headlines. Two guys in particular were responsible for this: William Randolph Hearst of the New York Herald and Joseph Pulitzer of the New York World. They were really the two that were going back and forth engaging in this battle for viewership. And Hearst, as we'll see, is basically going to sell the war to the American public. And he purchases the services of a frontier photographer named Frederick Remington to go to Cuba and get pictures of the terrible things General Weyler was doing. And he famously said, "You supply the pictures, I'll create the war." Right? This is the very definition of yellow journalism. The next one are the Jingos. We've talked about them with our vocab. This is the powerful group within the Republican Party, as a few Democrats that wanted to see overseas expansion. Teddy Roosevelt, Henry Cabot Lodge, and really McKinley was their vehicle to achieve this. Even though McKinley was not nearly as strong a Jingo as the others of his party. But Roosevelt believed he could exert his tremendous influence over him. Right? He famously says, you see here, he had the backbone of a chocolate eclair. And if you don't get that joke, go look up what an eclair is. It's really funny. If we look at direct causes, right? Direct causes. The first one, and really the most obvious that you see here in the image, is the USS Maine. It was a U.S. destroyer that was sent to Havana to protect American business interests in Cuba. And then on the morning of February 15th, 1898, an explosion ripped through the vessel, sinking it and killing almost everyone on board. And as you can see in the image here, William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer made good on their yellow journalism threats and basically, convinced the American public that Spain was responsible for this, right? Destruction of the warship, Maine was the work of an enemy. And it will lead to the rallying cry for this war, which is remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. Come to find out, in 1976, they did an investigation, and Spain had nothing to do with this. It wasn't a mine placed or anything like that. That some of the claims were. Instead, it was a spontaneous combustion in the coal room, which had happened in several other ships as well during this time period. The next thing is the Delome letter. The Delome letter was a letter written from the Spanish minister to the United States to a friend in Cuba that was intercepted and published, of course, in the American media. And it basically called McKinley a pansy. It called him a weak and a bitter for the admiration of the crowd. Basically saying that he wasn't going to do anything really to Cuba or to Spain. And of course, when this is published, McKinley really has no choice. He's getting the pressure from his party, he's getting the pressure from the media and from the public, and he decides to issue an ultimatum to the Spanish government. And again, you can see here the New York Journal, Spanish treachery, crisis is at hand. We're selling the war through the media. Really the beginning of American propaganda. And McKinley required that Spain end its little war with Cuba, end the prisoners that the butcher was keeping. And McKinley wanted to be a mediator in these negotiations. Spain would not agree to this, particularly the part about the armistice. So McKinley, following precedent from the Constitution, submits a declaration of war message to Congress, even though he really wasn't happy about it. But he knew, because he was worried what would happen to American business interests. Congress immediately declares war, and pretty unanimously. The only holdup to this was what we call the Teller Amendment from your vocab. Senator Henry Teller of Colorado added to the bottom of the Declaration of War resolution the Teller Amendment, which said that once the United States overthrew Spain, we would leave Spain and allow them to be independent. Right? This was an idea to appease the anti-imperialists in the nation, which we'll talk about. And this makes it seem as if America's fighting a noble war, right? We're just there to liberate. Obviously, we know that's not the case. And if you look at this cartoon, it would certainly appear that America is just there to liberate their patriot friends. The Spanish-American War is called the Splendid Little War because it lasts about 2.5 months. Spain really, at this point, was nothing. It was, beating them does not solidify us by any means as a world power. So much so that I always like to start with the example of the Philippines. The Philippines were also under control of Spain at the time, and Commodore George Dewey sailed his fleet into Manila to attack the Spanish. They had 7 ships. 3 were made of wood, and 1 had to be towed out into battle because the steam engine wasn't working. Dewey only had 1 man die, and that was because of heat stroke. So this is just kind of an introduction to just how easy this war is. That's why we call it the Splendid Little War. Really, the only problems we had anywhere were in Cuba, and it had nothing to do with the Spanish. The Americans were not prepared for fighting a tropical war. They wore woolen uniforms. You have what's called the embalmed beef scandal, where a lot of the beef went bad when it was transported to Cuba. And a number of soldiers would die as a result or get sick from it, lose a ton of weight. Ironically, the man who ate the best was the general who was leading the invasion of Cuba, William Shafter. And one publication said that he was the front. When we say the front, if you don't get that joke, I'm probably a loser. The next one is malaria. We were not prepared for malaria, which killed more troops than the Spanish did in the entire war, which is unbelievable. Really, the famous incident of Cuba is what we call the Rough Riders, which you see on your television screen, on your computer screen. They're a band of cavalry that was sent down from Florida. Now, you notice there are no horses in this photo. That's because Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, who charge up San Juan Hill in order to really push back the Spanish to Havana, their horses didn't make it to Florida. So they were a cavalry unit that had no horses. But their victory at San Juan Hill, really overwhelming because they outnumbered the Spanish something like 10-1, something ridiculous, is going to make him an American hero, which he will use, of course, in his run for the presidency. And after San Juan Hill, Battle of San Jacinto, we walk right into Havana, Santiago, take it. We get Puerto Rico as well, and the war's over. We force the Spanish to sign the Treaty of Paris, which I'll talk about, but not all were happy with American occupation, right? We get the creation of the Anti-Imperialist League by guys like Mark Twain, Samuel Gompers, Grover Cleveland, all of whom you see in here. And they really take the Declaration of Independence and some of Abraham Lincoln's words to explain why this is not what America should be. You're going to read that right now. Okay, so despite the best efforts of the Anti-Imperialist League, America has established itself firmly as a world power and as an imperial power. And with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, America, as you can see in this cartoon, really starts extending its reach over all of the Western Hemisphere. We're going to get Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, will be known as American Samoa, Puerto Rico. The U.S. pays $20 million for the Philippines as well. But it really asserts us not only as a world power, but as a major influence in the Far East. really helps end a lot of the north-south division now that there's a focus on something beyond just domestic borders, and certainly will further Teddy Roosevelt's career. The problem with having an empire is you have to rule that empire, right? That's generally the first thing. People don't like to be ruled. So what we get is an insurrection in the Philippines led by a guy named Emilio Aguinaldo, who's really considered to be like the George Washington of the Philippines. And was promised by the Americans that they were going to leave after the war. We know that's not going to happen, really because McKinley and other Jingos believe that the Philippines are far too valuable in trade, but also in resources and military bases to just let them go. Right. So you can see here in this political cartoon that Emilio is calling us really a traitor because of our imperialist tendencies. Emilio Aguinaldo is going to start what's called the Bolo War. And it's basically a 2-year civil war, brutal civil war that involves a massive American genocide in the Philippines. The American battle cry there was "Civilize them with Krag," and Krag is a weapon. So we were going to civilize the heathen savages with our weapons. And basically, after we put down the Civil War, we decided that we're going to stay in the Philippines until we decide that they are ready for their own self-government, which won't be until 1945. McKinley, once we take it over, appoints William Howard Taft, who will obviously go on to be president a little bit, to lead the commission, basically to civilize the Philippines with schools, with roads, all sorts of things like that, kind of bring them into the modern era. Then the issue is Cuba. What do we do with Cuba? We promised them with the Teller Amendment that we weren't going to stay. However, just like the Philippines, there are too many valuable resources for McKinley and the Jingos to get rid of it. Sugarcane, tobacco is going to be really important. It's incredibly important for strategic means now that we have Guantanamo Bay, that we have the naval base. So in 1902, we allow Cuba to become independent, but we insert something into their constitution called the Platt Amendment, again from your vocab, that allows Cuba, it basically tells Cuba, you cannot make treaties, you cannot do anything from a foreign relations perspective without supporting us. And it gives us access, as I mentioned, to Guantanamo Bay. And this will really be fuel for the fire for Cubans when we get to Fidel Castro's revolution and their hatred of America. Last thing I want to talk about quickly is the open door policy. We've talked about our assertion into the Far East now with the capture of the Philippines, and China is really the big area left of trade that we want to focus on. At the time, China really wasn't a dominant power and was basically divided up by the powers of Europe, as you can see in this political cartoon, into what we call spheres of influence, right? For example, Hong Kong was a sphere of influence for Great Britain, controlled by them entirely. And American businessmen were very fearful that they'd be left out of China because it had such incredible access to spices and trade. So John Hay, who's the Secretary of State for McKinley, institutes what's called the open door policy, which basically tells all the powers of Europe that you have to respect the trading rights of individual countries in China, and we're going to use our military to enforce it. And we're going to keep the door open to trade in China. The best example of this is the Boxer Rebellion. You have a group that really wants to overthrow European rule. It's called the Society of Righteous Harmonious Fists, otherwise known as the Boxers. And they want to drive out Europeans. So they start actually killing European Christians that are living in Peking, which today you would know as Beijing. So McKinley sends in the Marines. This is really the beginning of the use of the Marines, almost 2,000 of them, to restore European and American rule here, in order to show people that we will keep China open to trade. And this will really be the establishment of the American imperialism in the Far East.